If the question is why Hornbostel and why are we investigating him and why should we care about Hornbostel, you can say at the outset that he is somebody who was influential in his day in a way that has been largely forgotten. Not completely, but largely.
So he may have been a bit of a forgotten man in Pittsburgh, but that doesn't minimize in any way the extent of his accomplishments and his nationwide practice. And he was far more interesting as an architect than some of the people who developed more of a reputation. He was more adventurous.
I think Hornbostel is a terrific architect. Maybe if you don't have access to Pittsburgh, maybe you don't run into Hornbostel so much. I guess it still surprises me when I show this building to people and they shake their head and say, "Who is that architect again?"
Very well-traveled gentleman, very intelligent, had lots of connections, very well respected. We're very lucky in Pittsburgh that we have these fantastic buildings.
He's not an architect who has really received his due, whether it's on the Carnegie Mellon campus, whether it's in the streetscape of Albany, whether it's in the bridges of New York. But few people who might love one of those buildings in their local context have any idea of the overall shape of Hornbostel's career.
Somehow this man took every ordinary project and turned it into something special. He was an architect's architect.
When the smoke had cleared in 1865, the United States of America began the formidable task of reconstruction following the Civil War. Cities expanded around factories and foundries, but the desperately low wages of an unskilled workforce contributed to the rapid growth of tenements and slums.
Particularly in a time when American cities were growing tremendously because of industrialization and increase in population, and were growing in very haphazard ways. This was sort of a revelation to a lot of people that cities could be planned, and they could be planned in a very beautiful way, a very disciplined way.
Americans are beginning to feel that they have, in fact, a world place to play, but it turns out that they're still not comfortable. They're not sure that they have the skills, and so they looked to France, which was the other great democracy and republic. They essentially sent their sons and daughters there to be educated, believing that if they learned from what they considered the best of the time, they then would be able to give it a particular American view.
Undeniably, the best of the time was the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, France. This renowned institution that began in the court of Louis XIV offered the highest level of classical instruction in its Academy of Architecture. The most talented students from Europe and the United States applied to the prestigious academies with hopes of earning a place among the crème de la crème. A gifted young American architect named Henry Hornbostel was accepted and studied at the École des Beaux-Arts from 1893 to 1897.
While Hornbostel was a student, he had become renowned as l'homme perspective, because he could make these elaborate perspective drawings that would show the building the way it would actually look on the site. And students would gather around to watch him make these extraordinary drawings.
During his 4 years of instruction at the prestigious academy in France, Hornbostel was immersed in Parisian architecture and culture at precisely the time when the school's methods were gaining a dominant influence in the United States. At the Columbian Exposition of 1893, also known as the Chicago World's Fair, a particularly American version of Beaux-Arts architecture was featured in the Court of Honor. Architect and impresario Daniel Burnham directed a team of architects, artists, and landscape designers to produce the White City, a temporary metropolis of more than 200 buildings. The exposition's Court of Honor offered an exemplary vision for the future of American cities. Monumental buildings, broad avenues, and generous decorative landscapes. The White City gave rise to the City Beautiful movement in the United States.
Communities across the nation tried to duplicate or tried to get a sense of this into their own communities, this grandeur, this sophistication.
Classical revival architecture or Beaux-Arts architecture becomes not the only style in America, but certainly a prevailing one. And that sense that America gets covered with Roman temples and Renaissance palaces really gets a big boost from the 1893 fair in Chicago.
Upon his arrival back to New York in 1897, Hornbostel was enthusiastic and well prepared to apply his skills to the raw palette of the American urban landscape.
When Hornbostel returned to the United States from France, America was changing. It was turning from towns of wooden buildings to great cities of brick and terracotta. Great master plans were needed for buildings and complexes of buildings larger than had ever been built in the United States.
And so you have this world in which artists are coming together, and sculptors and painters, and they're working with architects to create these remarkable buildings. And this is the American Renaissance.
It wasn't long before Henry Hornbostel earned a reputation as a perennial contender in the most notable architectural design competitions in the country. Hornbostel settled into practice with George Palmer. Though they did not win, Hornbostel's firm made the shortlist for the New York Public Library, one of the city's most coveted commissions. Palmer, the successful businessman, had found in Hornbostel a preeminent architectural designer and offered him a partnership. Palmer's collaboration with the imaginative and bold Hornbostel positioned the firm to take advantage of an exceptional opportunity.
He happened to stumble right into this wonderful moment in time when Andrew Carnegie was getting people together to start the Carnegie Institute, which is now the Carnegie Art Museum and Library System. It's a moment where influential men with grand ideas have someone who's going to support them and pay for it and get the city behind them. So he was at the right place at the right time.
As a gift to the city of Pittsburgh, and as a means of supplying the city's factories with a sufficient quantity of skilled workers, steel magnate Andrew Carnegie proposed a world-class technical school to educate and train the mill workers of Pittsburgh and their sons. In 1904, with Hornbostel as chief designer, Palmer and Hornbostel submitted their design. Among 44 competing firms, including several of the most highly regarded architectural firms in the country, Palmer and Hornbostel won. In 1905, ground was broken in Pittsburgh on this historic $2 million venture.
He wins that competition because he can spread the functions of the school over this unusual site in a very effective and very efficient, but also beautiful way. And by comparison, the other designers were really kind of having difficulty getting the full school into this oddly shaped site.
Hornbostel's Beaux-Arts design paid tribute to Andrew Carnegie, the school's benefactor, in a delightfully playful manner.
When he was designing the technical school for Andrew Carnegie, He knew that Carnegie was a Scotsman and so proud of that Scottish heritage. And so the buildings are ornamented with thistles and thistle leaves and boughs from fir trees and pine cones, and all these things reminiscent of the Scottish Highlands.
He looks for opportunities to use materials that you wouldn't necessarily find used that way. This is a handrail, but it's a handrail made out of pipe stock because this is a place where people learn to use machine tools. Hornbostel wants to be responsive to his clients. He wants to use materials that are found nearby that are evocative of the immediate place.
And he could pick up on the attitudes and characteristics of his client and what they had hoped to achieve in their building. And he could do this in a grand way, and he could also do it in very subtle ways. When you go to Baker Hall, here Hornbostel sweeps you into this lobby with these curved, arched ceiling that then brings you around the corner to a stair like none other that you've ever seen. Hornbostel's using these Guastavino towels, these very thin layers of towel, small towels that could be put together to create almost any shape.
The Guastavino company is very clever in that they provide these materials in almost any color or texture or appearance that you like, almost like the range of materials you might have for a countertop in a kitchen decorating scheme today. But Hornbostel generally wants to take them on so that they express themselves. They're part of the language of what he's trying to do. He's doesn't opt for the ones that you could mistake for marble, that you could mistake for stone. He goes for the ones that actually make his architecture into a rich mosaic of new materials, new techniques, and a kind of very exciting synthesis of historic and cutting edge, of we could say, of sort of new and old.
Hornbostel was one of those architects that seemed to relish the detail. Hornbostel knew that the underneath side of the stair was sculpture on its own terms and would often make that ceramic tile.
Not only did Hornbostel suggest to Carnegie that he have a school of architecture, Hornbostel became a professor at that school of architecture. And for over a decade, he was the head of the Department of Fine Arts.
So he really comes on board as an architect building the buildings that one of which he'll eventually be teaching in. And of course the one he's teaching in is the masterpiece, but hey.
Overlooking Carnegie Tech's Central Mall, the College of Fine Arts is a triumphant composition designed to crown the multi-building ensemble that Hornbostel first envisioned in 1904. The 5 sculptural niches across its facade represent a lively and encyclopedic account of architectural history, presented as carved examples of medieval, Greek, Roman, Renaissance, and world styles. Inside the College of Fine Arts, the majestic foyer leads to performance and rehearsal spaces. The sprawling program of murals on the vaulted ceiling celebrates the history of the arts, featuring works of architecture and sculpture, as well as prominent historical figures of music and drama. In the Great Hall, niches provide display spaces for casts of favorite ancient and Renaissance sculpture on loan from the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The culminating piece is the magnificent portal surrounding the dean's office, once occupied by Hornbostel himself. The building is a tour de force of design mastery. The College of Fine Arts is certainly Hornbostel's most deliberate effort to make an emphatic statement about the power of architecture and the arts. And yet, unlike Hornbostel's earlier buildings of Carnegie Tech, which were widely published in the architectural press, the College of Fine Arts, the jewel of the ensemble, was never published. It is inconceivable that this masterpiece was somehow overlooked by Hornbostel's professional peers. What should have been recognized as the high point of Hornbostel's career, instead led to the split of the successful partnership that had begun in 1897.
Hornbostel builds the College of Fine Arts and Hammerschlag Hall without the partnership of George Palmer. And it's a bit of a mystery because there's very little paperwork, there's very little of a paper trail. We can suspect that the seed of this comes from Carnegie Tech, who says to Hornbostel, we need to have you on site, we need to have a Pittsburgh office that overlooks this project and not somebody coming back and forth from New York. Hornbostel responds by starting the building bureau at Carnegie Tech, and that is his office on the campus for these two buildings. But it seems very likely that the arrangement of the Carnegie Tech Building Bureau without Palmer on the construction of the College of Fine Arts and Hammerschlag Hall led to the split of the firm Palmer and Hornbostel.
In 1934, when George Palmer passed away, his obituary made no mention of his former partner, Henry Hornbostel, or of their most prestigious commission, Carnegie Tech.
Many people have wanted to understand American architecture by thinking of Beaux-Arts architecture as all temples and palaces, and that Beaux-Arts architecture is simply stuffy old historical things. Some of the people who like to think that way about Beaux-Arts architecture were the modernists. They like to say, sometimes with reason, but sometimes not, we are the modernists. We are contemporary, we are functional, we are technological and up to date.
With the modernist movement afoot, the Beaux-Arts style became a target for criticism. Louis Sullivan, a precursor of modernism, complained loudly that the derivative architecture of the White City set the art of architecture back 50 years.
That's where the misunderstanding about Hornbostel comes from, that, oh, he was educated in Paris, therefore he didn't know how to design for the years in which he actually lived. But not only did he design for his own time, he gave us a little bit of a glimpse into the architectural future as well.
Hornbostel was a legendary figure. When he would arrive, students would cut other classes to come in and see and hear the great man. When Hornbostel would approach a table and pick up a pencil to draw, a hush would fall over the room and the students would crowd around to see what he could do. Hornbostel and his sense of fun enlivened the Carnegie Mellon campus. He was also a larger-than-life persona. When you met Hornbostel, he was unforgettable.
He was notorious for being able to do an enormous amount of architectural work in a very short period of time, which would oftentimes free him up to have cocktails later in the day. He was a very inspiring teacher to a lot of students, and he was sometimes impatient with students who didn't quite have the same variety of talent that he did. He worked hard at architecture, but it also came very naturally to him.
It was he who started the Beaux-Arts Ball, this great springtime carnival for everyone, the faculty, the students, everyone to take part in the joyousness of life.
The idea was that the students would pick a theme, and based on this theme, they would make their own costumes, they would make props, they would make scenery, and they would have a huge party here in the School of Fine Arts building.
For the Carnegie Mellon Beaux-Arts balls, Hornbostel and his wife would get dressed up as a medieval king and queen with a beautiful gilt crown and flowing robes.
We have tons of photos which are just fantastic, including Hornbostel dressed as Charlemagne.
He enjoyed a good laugh, and he enjoyed involving others in that. And so that from time to time, Hornbostel would walk around with his pet monkey beside him. Hornbostel would show up at parties in bizarre costume and regalia. The man had a sense of fun that just wouldn't stop.
When the monkey passed on, the students had a formal funeral for it in the main hall of this building, of the Fine Arts Building. And the photos show the students with great big white handkerchiefs drying their eyes from all the sorrow. And they have a procession down to Schenley Park, where apparently they buried the monkey. So somewhere in Schenley Park is a monkey.
The carving of Hornbostel on the keystone in the center niche of the College of Fine Arts building depicts him as Bacchus. So he may not be immediately recognizable, but nevertheless, it's Hornbostel shown as Bacchus because the man liked to party.
Carnegie Tech is not the only place in Pittsburgh where Henry Hornbostel left his unmistakable imprint. In fact, of Hornbostel's 228 United States designs, 110 were planned for the Pittsburgh region.
Hornbostel's city-county building for Pittsburgh is really another favorite structure because he gives it in front this grand loggia, which is a public outdoor space that leads you into the interior of the building.
And you go through the little revolving door and you emerge into this golden hallway of columns and sunlight streaming in from two-story glass windows and an arched ceiling that's fretted with blue and white. And you just say, wow, oh my God, I can't believe this. You know, what you had expected on the outside, the plain gray wrapper has disappeared. And it's this wonderful, magical experience of entering a civic building. I mean, that's Henry Hornbostel.
The mayor's office is a beautiful office. And sometimes you forget how beautiful it is. And when visitors come in and they look around and they're really struck by its beauty, its design, its character.
The centerpiece of the mayor's office is a desk that was designed by Henry Hornbostel.
When you consider all of his work in Pittsburgh, I think two come to mind. One, the city-county building, which obviously houses our government. Secondly, Soldiers and Sailors, a wonderful structure in Pittsburgh, a landmark.
Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall in Pittsburgh, in a way, is one of Hornbostel's most conservative buildings because it is most straightforwardly classical with its Tuscan columns.
This was a building of monumental proportions, and Hornbostel built it so that it would stop a person walking by on the sidewalk. It is a colossal pile of stone with enormous statues and ornament and carvings and a great stepped roof that ends with sphinxes saluting the four corners of the world. It is a showstopper.
If you look at the light fixtures, you'll see behind the glass is gold leaf. So you get the reflection off the gold leaf coming out, and you get the light going through the crystal, these are elements that Hornbostel was very interested in. And you have to remember, in 1910, electricity was still kind of a new invention. So this was a showplace for some of these electrical companies and lighting companies to show off their most expensive, their most thrilling pieces. And Hornbostel took advantage of that for this building.
Road of Sholem in the early 1900s was largely a German immigrant congregation, a Reform congregation. Hornbostel designs this piece of architecture that has the yellow sulfur brick of Western Pennsylvania. It has the mansard roof of a Paris exhibition building or perhaps academic building.
Well, the detailing is exuberant, multicolored. And once again, it seems to me you can do this style in ways that are very staid, but Hornbostel is taking his Renaissance idiom and he is really doing it in a jazzy way. He's giving us color, he's giving us movement, he's giving us size, you see, and so it really becomes an extremely exuberant way of doing things.
The building was originally built in 1906-07, officially opened in September of 1907. chandeliers are wooden, and they were originally designed to be electrified, which was pretty novel at that time. So they're all original. We have pulleys that let them down to ground level so that lights can be changed and they can be cleaned.
He was in all the major magazines. He belonged to the finest architectural organizations in the country. He was looked upon as a leader.
In the early 20th century, Pittsburgh buildings and projects frequently appeared in architecture magazines and journals. This was perhaps the time period, aside from the post-World War II Renaissance, when Pittsburgh was most in the public eye in terms of architecture. And certainly Hornbostel was one of the very key figures in making that happen.
Hornbostel, like most Americans of that era, were very proud of being first. And Hornbostel often worked this into his own commissions. When he designed the Schenley Apartments, they were the largest apartment building in the city of Pittsburgh. 3 years later, he gets a commission for another apartment. What could he do? He decided he'd make it taller. He made the tallest apartment building in the city of Pittsburgh. When Hornbostel designed the Grant Building downtown, it was the tallest building in the city of Pittsburgh. This idea of stretching the proportions and doing the best and the biggest was something that Hornbostel liked. He would ask the suppliers, how big can you make a plate glass window with no supports? And then he would try to work it into his project. How long can we make a steel truss to support this roof?
Hornbostel was the first architect in America to design and build a government building as a skyscraper. In 1902, he had proposed a skyscraper for New York's City Hall, but unfortunately, that building was never realized. A few years later, in Oakland, California, Hornbostel pitched his innovative skyscraper plan, and it was enthusiastically embraced. Charged with rebuilding the city after the great earthquake of 1906, Oakland's mayor, Frank Mott, sponsored an architectural design competition for a new city hall.
And Hornbostel comes in, he suggests this design, it's this new combination. It's very compelling, it's a romantic image, and it's also something that's going to work well. And of course, the notion of a skyscraper is both functional because it gives you a lot of office space, but it's also iconic. It gives the city of Oakland a chance to take some of the profile and the visibility that usually San Francisco has gotten.
When the building was completed, it was 320 feet tall to the top of the clock tower. It was not only the tallest building in California, but it was the tallest building west of the Mississippi River.
The building was nicknamed Mott's Wedding Cake, in part because Mayor Mott married Gertrude Bennett the same year the construction began. But the nickname also refers to the stepped profile and lavish ornament. Mott's Wedding Cake only hints at the complex structure, where hidden windows illuminate a multi-floor grand hall above which a skyscraper rises. At the heart of the entire complex is a remarkable centerpiece.
The staircase is the reason to visit the lobby. It is a ceremonial stair of grand proportions.
I think that what was interesting to me about Hornbostel, especially as I wrote a book about New York around 1900, was his ability and his interest in combining architecture with the most sophisticated structural engineering at the time.
When Hornbostel worked on the Hellgate Bridge in New York City, it was the longest steel arch span in the world. This idea of stretching the proportions and doing the best and the biggest was something that Hornbostel liked.
The Hellgate Bridge is particularly beautiful, the arch and the roadbed for the tracks, and the way it threads through these triumphal arches, as it were, of stone, but also the way he carries what was very new then, overhead electrical wires for trains, made into architecture. So today's term would be the architecture of infrastructure, and he was a master at it.
One of Hornbostel's most acclaimed works is the New York State Education Building in Albany, New York. Another project Hornbostel won through a national design competition. With its sprawling colonnade of 36 90-foot Corinthian columns, this building calls to mind the 1893 Columbian Exposition.
The most surprising thing about the education building is just the magnitude of the place. From the street, it looks enormous. It runs nearly 600 feet from one end of the building to the other on Washington Avenue across the street from the Capitol. Yet, once you get inside the building itself, there are just soaring spaces, multi-story spaces. From the second floor rotunda, you can look all the way to the roof. It's over 90 feet from the floor to the skylight.
The New York State Education Building is an absolutely astounding surprise. And very little on the exterior of this building prepares you for this extraordinary, I suppose we could call it, aesthetic, technical experimentation inside. It's a very experimental building, and you don't expect that by its august exterior, nor by its dedication to sort of greatness as a formation for public education. And so there are these astoundingly thin Guastavino vaults, probably among the most beautiful and the least known. In these thin iron columns, which for a historian of French 19th century architecture, as I am, take you immediately back to Paris and to the two great reading rooms of the architect Henri Labrouste, who created some of the most astounding libraries of the 19th century and some of the most influential, and who likewise scarcely prepared his visitors for a kind of magical world that was going to be inside a very different kind of envelope.
In 1915, Henry Hornbostel was commissioned to develop the architectural plans for Emory University. Thanks to a generous land grant by Asa Candler, president of the Coca-Cola Company, the university would be built on 740 acres in metropolitan Atlanta, Georgia. The campus is adjacent to Druid Hills, a park-like suburban community designed by America's foremost landscape architect, Frederick Law Olmsted. Hornbostel complemented Olmsted's plan by constructing Emory within a picturesque Arcadian campus.
It was built on how someone would approach these buildings. You would approach them through a treed landscape. You would cross bridges that would go across ravines, and you would come across this very commanding group of classical buildings set on this piece of land, sort of rising out of the ravines.
Although the university's building plans were scaled back from Hornbostel's original design, his singular touch is evident in Emory's pink and gray Georgia marble buildings.
As an architect, there are very few people that have ever used Georgia pink marble on any building successfully. It's pretty garish. And somehow he does it in a way where, again, very sophisticated application. The color doesn't seem to be an issue. And then he hones the marble, and he shows absolutely no joints in it, so it's absolutely flat on the building in a very modernist kind of application.
In 1983, acclaimed architect Michael Graves was awarded the commission to expand the Michael C. Carlos Museum at Emory University.
Seeing these buildings of Hornbostel was an extraordinary experience and something I'll never forget, because immediately it struck me that whoever this was as I didn't even know at the time. The architect knew how to do that very precious kind of college building. But these buildings of learning were something that had the right amount of connectivity to each other and somehow the right amount of transparency with the campus. And then I did find out about Hornbostel, and the more I found out, the more I liked. He simply loved making buildings. I would love to talk to him.
In 1917, as the first building phase of Emory University was nearing completion, President Woodrow Wilson declared war on Germany. The United States was soon embroiled in World War I. Astonishingly, Henry Hornbostel, a 50-year-old man, enlisted in the Army and found himself in the European war theater in the thick of battle, assigned as a gas officer. Despite the military's strict regulation requiring soldiers in the gas brigade to be clean-shaven, Henry Hornbostel convinced his commanding officers to make an exception.
Hornbostel, though, was a man of fashion, and he prized his Van Dyke beard as part of his image. And so he had to show to his commanding officer that he could secure his gas mask perfectly to his face without any interference from his beard. And the Army agreed and allowed him to be one of the few soldiers to sport a beard.
The persuasive Hornbostel, whose charm had often influenced his clients, had prevailed once again. When Major Hornbostel returned to the States at the end of the war, he oversaw the final phase of construction at Emory University. In addition, he built Collinwald, a sumptuous 24-room home he had designed in 1915 for the president of the Coca-Cola Company, Asa Candler. Here, Hornbostel combines elements of traditional Gothic, Tudor, and Renaissance styles to produce this 20th century beauty. Collinwald was completed in 1920.
It just shows you the kind of, first of all, the skill that he had, but also the kind of freedom that he felt as an architect to use the classics or use styles of the past in almost any way that he wanted to.
One of the hallmarks of Hornbostel's success during this early 20th century period is that he wins more architectural competitions than anybody else who is practicing architecture in the United States. It's a little bit difficult to measure because some of these are very prominent and well publicized. Others of them are smaller and less well known. But when you go through the lists and go through the publications of these many architectural competitions that are published in the magazines, when you count them up, you realize that it's true.
In America, the Roaring '20s represented the Jazz Age. Popular jazz music became a means for young people to express their desire for independence. The war was over, and America was flush with jobs and money. The early years of the new decade seemed like one raucous party. Hornbostel's reputation was well established, especially in Pittsburgh, but he understood the limitations of working independently. He formed a partnership with Eric Fisher Wood. Wood was a decorated war hero and successful businessman with a larger-than-life reputation. In contrast to his dashing personality, Wood's architectural work was far less than dramatic and even prosaic. He needed Hornbostel's adventurous design skills. Together, they collaborated on several significant projects.
Hornbostel's career takes an interesting shift in the 1920s because he continues to work in Pittsburgh. Through the 1920s, Hornbostel builds things like the Webster Hall, which was basically a condominium and apartment building. He builds things like the Shenley Apartments, which are also fancy apartment buildings right nearby. He builds the University Club, which is right near Soldiers and Sailors. They don't quite have the pomp and circumstance of the older Beaux-Arts style buildings, but they're still gracious, they still have some interesting details, and they are part of what puts Hornbostel's stamp on the city of Pittsburgh.
Having the Aluminum Company of America here allowed Hornbostel to experiment with aluminum before many other architects in the country knew what it was. Hornbostel designed the first outdoor major use of aluminum in the city, the Smithfield Congregational Church in downtown Pittsburgh. The city of Pittsburgh Building Inspection didn't know if they should even improve it. Finally, they decided he could use the aluminum, but he had to use a steel structure to hold it up, because that they understood.
What's interesting is that that's what happens with Beaux-Arts architecture as it becomes Art Deco and related styles in the 1920s and 30s. It becomes more abstract. It becomes more related to technology.
Machine-age imagery was considered forward-thinking and progressive. By contrast, Beaux-Arts architecture was regarded as passé, an ideology littered with appropriations from the past. And so, Henry Hornbostel's star failed to rise as the Art Deco movement gained momentum.
He is not an outstanding Art Deco architect. He's sort of an okay one, but he really suggested, at least implicitly, the development of that style 20 years earlier.
Through his partnership with Wood, and due to the booming post-war economy, Hornbostel managed to remain busy and profitable throughout most of the 1920s. But in an environment in which prestigious skyscrapers were cropping up around the country, Hornbostel found it nearly impossible to remain in the spotlight.
Buildings were no longer simply one or two story as they had, or 2 to 3 story as they had been in Europe for 500 years. They were now leaping up into the skies, spanning ravines, and new technologies were pushing architecture forward in a way that had never happened before.
Hornbostel's Grant Building, completed in 1930, was the first high-rise in Pittsburgh designed in a contemporary style. But projects such as the Grant Building were largely overlooked in the midst of an era during which there seemed no end to the monumental scope and accelerated pace of urban development and construction. But the end did come. On October 29, 1929, the worldwide stock market crash ushered in the Great Depression. Thousands upon thousands of building projects in the United States immediately were suspended, leaving the majority of architects without work. Worse, the savings and investments of most, including Hornbostel, were wiped out when the largest banks collapsed. For Hornbostel, the financial catastrophe and its repercussions were eerily familiar. While Henry was a student at Columbia University, his father was bankrupted, unable to escape the aftershock of the Panic of 1873, and had lost his seat on the New York Stock Exchange. The family sold their home in Brooklyn. Both Henry and his older brother Eddie had no choice but to leave Columbia University. Despite the dire circumstances, Henry viewed his situation with a remarkably positive attitude. Hornbostel wrote, "There is no doubt that if this tragedy had not overtaken the family, that my professional accomplishment would not have appeared. If Father had stayed rich, I would have done nothing." Hornbostel's optimistic outlook and resilient nature served him once again during the Great Depression. Hornbostel never let on that he was in financial distress. In fact, one anecdote recounts that his beloved wife Patty died in 1931 unaware that the Hornbostel family was all but penniless. In 1932, Hornbostel married Maybelle Weston, a Pittsburgh school teacher 30 years his junior. While Hornbostel's personal life was on an upswing, his professional life was headed in the opposite direction.
Hornbostel was a very respected member of the faculty. As the years went on, he didn't have the same sort of relationship with the presidents. And finally, the time came when the people in power decided we needed to move on and do something new, and it was not very graceful.
The 1930s, to a large degree, are a very difficult time for Hornbostel. The economic crash causes work to dry up, and he loses his personal fortune. Economic times seem very bleak, and the long-term association with Carnegie Tech, where he's something of a founder, suddenly evaporates, and he is looking for a new direction and figuring out what to do next.
Public works programs had provided jobs for thousands during the Hoover administration. In the 1930s, under Democratic President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, public works projects increased significantly. Architects and building contractors were put to work designing and constructing schools, post offices, and a variety of recreational facilities. Hornbostel's pro bono project for a Joyce Kilmer Memorial had been well received, and in 1936, it led to Hornbostel's appointment as Allegheny County's Director of Parks and Aviation, where he designed and oversaw the construction of modest additions to the county airport building.
At the Allegheny County Airport, Hornbostel was able to add 2 wings to the existing building, but he redesigned the entrance drive in 2 parallel roads with 2 cross connectors. So as you flew over in an airplane, you looked down and saw HH, his own initials.
Hornbostel's work at Allegheny County Parks was much more extensive.
Hornbostel perhaps revealed some of his sympathetic understanding of land and landscapes when he became the director of the Allegheny County Parks much later in his life. It was during the Depression. He didn't have much work.
North and South Park each encompassed more than 1,500 acres and featured golf courses, playgrounds, playing fields, and picnic areas nestled within pastoral western Pennsylvania woodlands. Ever the publicist, Hornbostel created opportunities to ensure that the county parks were often featured in the newspapers.
And on opening day of the lake, Hornbostel arrives, regaled from head to toe in full dress admiral uniform of the U.S. Navy. And they said, what was he doing? And he says, I am in charge of the first fleet of the North Park Lake.
Hornbostel assumed a variety of responsibilities in his new position, and to his delight, among these was the task of designing 2 humble, low-budget buildings.
The South Park Golf Club uses a Mayan motif in the architecture. Hornbostel, in his love of travel, had visited the Yucatan Peninsula just after the turn of the century and brought back some of the very first photographs of Mayan architecture, and waited most of his career before he had the chance to incorporate that signature curved doorway into one of his buildings.
This building that is kind of festive, as I say, it looks like an Italian villa. It's at the top of the hill. I mean, it's a place to change your shoes on a public golf course. It is nothing fancy, but it looks fancy from a distance, and it comes across as a building that he had a good time designing. And it makes you feel good about coming up that hill and getting your start out on the golf course.
By this time, Hornbostel was in his mid-70s. And for Hornbostel, that didn't mean much of a noticeable sense of aging. A colleague at that time said Hornbostel, at age 76, could still outdrink, outdance, and outeat any man who was 40 years old. Hornbostel eventually, though, decided it was time to retire.
In 1939, Hornbostel and his wife, Maybelle, left Pittsburgh and relocated to The Elms, a gentleman's farm in the pastoral town of Harwinton, Connecticut.
And there they purchased a elegant historic home built in 1819, restored that home and a couple hundred acres of ground, and Hornbostel became the squire of the property and a great vegetable farmer. And he would invite his Pittsburgh colleagues to come up and tour the vegetable farm, and he was very proud of his tomatoes and his melons and his beets, and would walk the property. It became an annual event to celebrate Hornbostel's birthday.
My memories way back is that we would go to visit him as family, but more often there was some event in his garden. Summertime is when outdoor parties were, so we were allowed to go since we weren't too destructive to the inside of the house. Back in the early 1900s, the town hall civic building burned down. He designed a replacement, and it was in the grand style that he liked, but it was rebuilt. He did it pro bono for the town, and it's Henry Hornbostel's contribution to the town.
Hornbostel felt a genuine affection for Harwinton and adored the small-town life.
Every morning he'd get up and raise the flag, and every evening he'd come take it down. It's across the street from his house.
Hornbostel and his wife, after many cold winters in Connecticut, decided to move to Florida. And Henry Hornbostel again was architect, and this time for his own home. And he designed for himself a very modernist building. And he said, boy, if I was just 40 years younger, I could show those kids something new about modern architecture.
In 1961, at the age of 94, Henry Hornbostel passed away at Melbourne Beach, Florida. He was laid to rest back home in Harwinton, Connecticut.
Uncle Henny was the major. That was his rank in World War I, and I think he was very proud of that. You'll see on his gravestone, he's buried as Major Henry Hornbostel.
By the time America reached the 1950s, there was a new aesthetic, and that aesthetic was one of simple rectangular square buildings. Hornbostel was, in a way, very lucky he practiced in the era in which he worked, because he had the opportunity to design in this grand manner and with elegant materials, and that type of work was appreciated in his day.
The rising tide of enthusiasm for Beaux-Arts architecture that had crested in the late 19th and early 20th centuries had fallen. With Hornbostel's passing came a low point of appreciation for Beaux-Arts architecture. 3 years after Hornbostel's death, a masterpiece of Beaux-Arts architecture, Pennsylvania Station in New York City, was demolished. Designed and built by the renowned firm McKinn, Mead & White and completed in 1910, Pennsylvania Station was regarded as the grandest train station in the world. Modeled after the baths of Caracalla of ancient Rome, the immense pink granite train station spanned 2 midtown Manhattan blocks and featured a colonnade of 84 Doric columns. Out of this tragedy, however, grew a passionate preservation movement. Today, in the United States, there are thousands of structures that have been designated as historic landmarks. Hundreds of these survivors are Beaux-Arts classics. Of Hornbostel's 225 buildings, bridges, and monuments, 22 are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. This collection of rich, imaginative, magnificent pieces of American architecture. This is Henry Hornbostel's legacy.
As we understand his works better, we appreciate them as art, we appreciate them as buildings and spaces and environments that remind us how rewarding and how substantive architecture can be. When you have a beautiful downtown and public spaces, it's not simply a matter of an economic amenity, although that's really true, but it's also an indicator that this is a city or this is a society in which people can interact with each other and go about their lives of business, of politics, of recreation in ways that are rewarding and even socially just. Architecture isn't just beauty and art, it's really a barometer of how well a society is working.
Hornbostel's career really spanned the same period as the great industrial growth of industry in America.
Hornbostel was certainly an architect who left an imprint. That imprint was, at the beginning, very obvious in New York City, but it's most obvious, obviously, in the Pittsburgh region, where he designed numerous buildings, numerous very prominent buildings, numerous buildings that are distinctly his, numerous buildings that are recognizable as being Henry Hornbostel.
What architecture can do, what architecture, one of its great roles in the history of mankind has been to record mankind. Henry Hornbostel's work is true architecture. It transforms the idea of buildings through the expression of culture and purpose of a certain time or place. They're very rare in today's world. They're becoming more and more rare.
I can see him appreciating Pittsburgh, and that's why that's one of the reasons the buildings we have of his are so fantastic. He never sold us short. We always got the best from him. He never sold us short, which is nice.
He created buildings in Pittsburgh that are not simply works of art, but works of art that enhance the qualities of living in this particular location and that give an artistic identity to this particular location.
Look at the buildings that really matter and the buildings that still speak to people. And this is where you find Hornbostel stands out. He was able, in his era, to build buildings that not only astonished the people of his own day, but still surprise and delight us today.